Brilliant, thank you. We'll get started. Hello and welcome. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Conservative Environment Network's latest event. My name's John Flesher. I'm the Deputy Director at CEN. We are, if you don't know, the independent forum for Conservatives in the UK and around the world who support net zero, nature restoration and resource security. This event is entitled Is Free Trade Good for the Environment? It's kindly been sponsored by Unchecked UK, whose co-director Phoebe joins us today. Thank you very much, Phoebe, for your support in putting on this event. Joining Phoebe, we have another stellar CEN panel. I'm joined by Ben, now Lord Houchen, the Conservative Mayor of Tees Valley, Robert Courts, the Conservative MP for Witney in West Oxfordshire and former government minister, and in a last minute and very grateful change to the billing, Eamonn Ives, the head of research at the Entrepreneurs Network. Eamonn, thank you very much for stepping in as our previous speaker wasn't able to make it up on the motorway in time, sadly. Looking at this issue of free trade and the environment, the Conservative Party's wrestled with this issue, I think, as long ago as the 1840s when we were arguing about the repeal of the Corn Laws and whether that was a good idea. But I think really it's since Brexit, trade has become a big political issue again, and it's something we've had to consider in a way that we just didn't when we were members of the European Union. We've struck free trade deals as an independent trading nation now with Australia and New Zealand, as well as some of our tied over Brexit deals. We're now negotiating several others, most notably with India, which is apparently seems to always be on the cusp of about being signed. These deals have been, in many ways, very good things. Their supporters argue it's about increasing the UK's market share, getting our products out there, helping to spread our message in a diplomatic sense as well. But they've been very controversial in many respects as well, with criticism that the government's compromised on standards, particularly regarding the environment, by allowing the UK to be flooded with low-quality produce, especially food, and it's met with a lot of criticism from the agricultural sector in particular. Add to this wider concerns that our trade policy and our industrial policy has allowed in many respects China to dominate key supply chains in areas like solar panels and electric vehicles and batteries, and may have therefore resulted in hollowing out some of our manufacturing base in parts of the country. But equally, free trade has a fantastic role to play, potentially at least, in a more efficient use of resources, allowing cheaper products, and in increasing the UK's reach around the world. So I'm very keen that we get into these issues. Are the criticisms fair? How do we strike the right balance between high standards and the benefits of free trade? And crucially, can free trade ultimately, if we get our policy right, be good for the mission to go green? I'm going to take each of our panelists in turn for some short opening remarks of about 3 minutes maximum, and then I'll lead with a couple of questions, and then please get thinking as I will go out into the audience for your contributions too. If you'd like to tweet along, our Twitter handle is @CEN, @CEN_HQ, and you can use the hashtags CEN@CPC and CPC23. Without further ado, I will turn to Ben Houchen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to the Conservative Environment Network for inviting me. I just wanted to set out in slightly more strategic terms why obviously I think that free trade is pretty essential to not just meeting the requirements of net zero, but actually as a future economic powerhouse driver for the UK. And I actually think there's a wonderful relationship between what's happening on Teesside and what the UK should be doing over the next 10, 20 and 50 years. And if you look at what we're trying to achieve, what we're trying to do is use technology, human ingenuity and the free market to be able to deliver the net zero benefits that we're trying to see. So I can say that on behalf of the UK, Teesside is delivering the world's first industrial scale carbon capture and storage facility. It's going to be an almost 1 gigawatt gas-fired power station, but it's going to have carbon capture technology built into it. So it's going to produce enough power to power 1.3 million homes. It's going to capture all of that carbon and it's going to bury it 3 miles under the North Sea. Interestingly and quite poetically, I think, putting the carbon back into the depleted oil fields that we've been pumping out of the North Sea for many, many decades now. What's really interesting about that, it's a great project in and of itself and it leads to other major investment. But this is where I think the UK needs to be very smart on how we trade with the rest of the world and what we require from free trade deals. Because what we've found in Teesside by delivering that project, we are getting inundated with visits from governments from North America, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Japan, Korea, and everywhere in between, because they want to understand how we're delivering that technology and how can they then export and use that technology to help fight net zero and their carbonisation requirements in the years to come. And they're looking at the UK and specifically Teesside for that. And so what I think is when you've got China on the one end, and I think John has set out the challenge very succinctly and very well, and you've got the Americans on the other end with IRA, I think I look very pragmatically and see that the UK is never going to be able to compete with the US from a financial firepower point of view. I mean, the subsidies in IRA are eye-watering. At the last estimate, the idea was that IRA was going to cost the US about $320 billion. Last estimate I'd heard it was about 1.2 trillion because of the take-up and the interest internationally as well as domestically. The UK is not going to be able to compete on that level with that level of subsidy. And in the same way that China have cornered the market in some supply chains, it's also increasingly difficult. But what we can do is what we've always done as a nation. We can come up with ideas, we can develop products, we can create incredible IP, we can build it here first, and then we can export our people, our IP, and our quality and standards to the rest of the world. And I think we've got to get very smart about how we work on a global scale. The Americans are trying to buy a ticket to this economy for the next 100 years with their subsidy. The Chinese are doing it in a slightly more, I don't know what the word is for it, but in a different way.
We can all guess.
Yeah, and we've got to be very savvy about how we meet both of those challenges, and I think we've got to be quite nuanced. And so lots of people talk about the response to IRA and the Chinese question. I think actually we've got to come up with a UK solution to it, and I think there is one around using that ingenuity that we've had to be able to unlock trade agreements, and then also as part of those trade deals, spin it on its head and use that to be able to export those standards to the rest of the world, rather than turning it the other way around, which is we're having to meet their standards. Because let's not forget, these nations, I am telling you, are coming to the UK to understand the quality of what we're doing, the technology that we're using, and how they can use it. And so that should be a weapon in our arsenal to deliver those trade deals, but also get these nations to meet our standards rather than a race to the bottom on some of their standards.
Brilliant, thank you, Ben. A great positive start to the debate. Robert Courts.
Thank you, and thanks good to see so many people here. This is in many ways one of the big issues of our time, because we live in a globalised world, and the way in which we meet that is going to be one of the issues that determines our success as a nation and our profitability and how prosperous we are in the years ahead. I think there will always be some challenges and some opportunities, and that sort of sounds a bit politician-y, I suppose, to say that there's always going to be a plus on one side and a positive on the other, but it is nonetheless true. But I think the first thing we should remember is that we now have control of our own policy. We have an independent trade policy, and there will be some decisions that we have to make on issues of how far we are prepared to go in order to get a deal, or do we accept a lower level of deal? Because, of course, the issue often isn't deal or not, it's how deep and how friction-free that deal is. So there is a decision there for us to be taken, and the key thing is frankly for education. I think that is true for all of us. It's true for us as parliamentarians as well. We haven't had a free independent trade policy for many years. The UK is out of practice on this. People aren't as up to speed on some of these sometimes quite complex concepts in the way that we're going to need to be. So we have to tool up and to learn the tools of the trade in order to be able to scrutinise this. And that's true for public discourse as it is as much for parliamentarians. But it's all underpinned by the fact that we do have the ability now to make our own decisions, and we can make those according to the priorities that we set, but of course we have to decide what those priorities are going to be first. But one thing that we can be absolutely clear about is that a couple of things, in principally environmental standards and animal welfare, are ones that the UK has put the very highest store on, always has and always will. And the government's been absolutely clear about this, that it isn't going to sacrifice either of those two things. So those are principles that we can outline from the beginning, and those are principles that I'm confident we will continue to look at. So that's, we also need to remember the opportunities that are out there as well. We tend to look at this from the point of view of a slightly defensive point of view. What do we have to do to make sure that we protect our industries? And that's right. And this is, as John's already said, this is an issue that runs through the very DNA of the Conservative Party. The issue between free trade and protectionism. Of course, in the Corn Law time, it more or less broke the party. So there is always that tension we have to look at. But there are huge opportunities. there are opportunities for every sector of the economy, principally because of the very high standards and the very high quality mark that we have. So there is a real cachet to having things that are produced or made in the UK. There is a real practical ability to have things transported from using this big UK hub. We have incredible growth areas and areas that are really exciting and have a huge opportunity provided they have access to the rest of the world. And of course Ben represents one of those real white hot areas of progress. So there are opportunities there as well, but I also think we have to accept the reality that we live in a world that is globalized. World trade is a thing. It's not going away. It's here, and we need to shape it. And that is by being involved in the large organisations, by getting involved in things like CPTPP. So, as Ben was saying a minute ago, to export the standards we have rather than feeling threatened by standards that others have. Many of the challenges that we have are in terms of the EU trade as well, and we need to continue to look at that, because everything that underpins this must be, there's one word really more important than any other, which is fairness. We have to ensure that we are making sure that any deals that we sign are fair to those who are working here, to our own producers, as well as the opportunities, and that is as true of the existing EU deal and the standards underneath that as it is for ones in the future. So we need to get better at talking about those, and I think I'll probably run out of time, but the last point I'll make, just to open it up, because we'll come back to this I'm sure in due course, is that we also need to have greener transport. Because you can only facilitate free trade and have it for the good of the environment if it is transported in a clean and green way, and aviation and maritime of course has been part of that. I'm very passionate about it, I suspect you'll know. Maybe a question will come on that without writing my own questions.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Robert. Well, if it doesn't, I'm very glad you mentioned it. It's a very, very important area. I'm going to hand over next to Phoebe Clay, the co-director of our partner today, Unchecked. Thank you, Phoebe.
Thank you so much. Yes, I represent an organisation called Unchecked UK. We stand alongside 70 or so other organisations who care deeply about social and environmental protections. And a bedrock of what we do is to engage the public. We do a lot of polling and focus grouping, and really kind of getting to that kind of key question around where is the public on standards. And what we find broadly is that the UK public is more or less an outlier in terms of free trade. That protectionist sort of seam that seems to be penetrating many other developed countries hasn't quite made its mark in the UK psyche. However, we also know that this is not a blank check, that people expect trade to be underpinned by two things. One is fairness. No one wants us to be pushed around when coming to strike trade deals, but also standards. As you've just mentioned, Robert, there's certain standards that the British public sees as almost articles of faith: animal welfare, food standards, and I think increasingly environmental standards. So that is, for me, what I call the compact around free trade. We need to sort of kind of deliver on that kind of on that expectation, and I think it's fair to say that, at least the way that it's being reported in the media, there might a bit of complacency has kind of made its way into the notion that we are all behind the free trade deal. There seems to be a real urgency around sort of striking new deals, and that in places we are prepared to compromise on standards. And I guess this is a really risky sort of situation to be in. We really feel passionately that in order to retain that kind of level of public buy-in into our sort of global vision, a sort of a mentality that we should be out there pursuing new trading relationships, needs to be underpinned by three things. The first, and I think both of you have just mentioned them, that idea of a race to the top. This must not be a kind of a race to the bottom whereby we kind of compromise on our standards in the pursuits of deals. I think the second thing that we haven't talked so much about yet is transparency. The need to really be much more open to scrutiny, both by parliamentarians but also by the broader public. I think a lot of the trade deal conversations are taking place at a very, very high level, and often, some of the kind of more complicated aspects of them are being kind of pushed aside and not being debated openly. And I guess the final thing is about a sort of level playing field. There has to be legal enforceability around all the trade deals that we strike in order to ensure that A, these are fair deals, and B, that we actually don't end up compromising on standards by default. So yes, I really welcome the comments, but yes, perhaps we can get into a bit more detail about how we actually deliver on this high standard trade deal agenda.
I certainly hope so. Thank you very much, Phoebe. And last but by no means least, Eamonn.
Hi everyone. So yeah, as John mentioned, I was a last minute stand-in. So if it sounds like I'm making it up on the spot, maybe that's because I am. But that's never stopped me before. So yeah, is free trade good for the environment? I think I have to say quite categorically yes. Above anything else, if there's one thing that free trade allows us to do, it is that it allows us to produce things a lot more efficiently. And I think efficiency is a word that often gets overlooked in the environmental debate, and it's probably one of the more important ones, certainly in my vocabulary at least. If we wanted to try and produce all the things that we demand in society ourselves, well, A, I don't think it would be possible for us to do that. B, even if it were, I think it would come at a much higher environmental cost than in the sort of the counterfactual world of free trade, which hopefully we live in. We could, for instance, grow all manner of exotic fruits and things like that in greenhouses. We just have to do so by burning a lot of fossil fuels to heat them. Maybe one day we can produce that energy in a green and sustainable way, but I think much as an environmentalist as I am, I think we're a little way off that. And it's far better to just kind of import it instead. Second, free trade is an immense driver of wealth creation. It's probably been the single greatest force for alleviating poverty in the last 300 years or so. What some of that wealth we can use to direct to do is to help us protect the environment much more better than we could otherwise. So that's kind of my second point. And then my final point, and perhaps somewhat flippantly, free trade enables us to trade ideas and technologies and the ways through which we will ultimately overcome all of the environmental challenges that face us and that sort of stand before us. It would be nonsensical if we were to say that one country develops a clean and cheap and abundant way to produce energy, but because it got produced somewhere else, we're not going to import that technology across into the UK or wherever it might be. So they're kind of my sort of three scattered points, and I'd be more than happy to kind of pick up on them in the discussion and certainly to pick up on the other things. What I certainly won't do is kind of gloss over the fact I think there are sort of cases at the margin where sort of trade and the environment are in a little bit more of a tension. But as this is a fringe event, let's not let nuance get in the good way of a good panel discussion.
I heartily agree. Thank you very much, Eamonn. I'm going to come out to the audience for Q&A shortly, but I'd just like to begin with a question to some of the panelists. And Phoebe, I'll come to you first on this. I mean, I want to get to the sense of this tension that I think has come out in the remarks so far about where the trade-off exists between high standards versus actually enabling these deals and getting what we hope will ultimately be cheaper produce, whatever it may be, into the UK. For you, is it a sense of having a set of standards that are very clear, no matter who we're trading with, those are the standards and those are our red lines, or is this a moving feast depending on what the actual situation is?
I think the broad approach should be to set our current standards as the benchmark, and indeed, where possible, think about ways in which we can use trade deals to raise those standards. And I think, as others have said, I mean, most international most of our trading partners anticipate that the UK will have high standards. Our reputation is as a country that really cares about these things, that really sets the bar high on things like animal welfare, on things like food standards. So I think it's perfectly it's really important that we actually sort of say, this is where we're working from, this is where we are now, and we want to work upwards, not downwards from there.
Brilliant. And related to that, Robert, I know you were a supporter of our trade deals that we struck with Australia and with New Zealand, and you'll be aware, no doubt coming from the constituency you do, about some of the tension that exists there and what maybe your local farmers, or at least the agricultural community as a whole, had concerns about that. Again, at what point do we have to be prepared to compromise, to strike deals, versus where do we say enough is enough? And I'm thinking particularly with regard to the agricultural side, where there was a concern, certainly voiced by a lot of farming groups, that we're now allowing cheap, low quality agricultural produce from Australia and particularly to come into the UK market.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, and you're right to distinguish between the two trade deals, because the Australia and New Zealand trade deals are different and don't have the same standards, and the concern particularly was around the Australian one. We do need to be careful that we don't also elide concepts of standards and volumes. I mean, there's a lot of those concerns, which yes, I'm very aware of, and we do need to make sure that those are properly reflected, are around volume rather than standards per se. I don't think we ought to fall into the trap of thinking that the way the EU does things, which is the system we have inherited, is the only way in which they can be done. Often you're talking about things being done slightly differently rather than an undercut, which is the way it's always put by our opponents as a race to the bottom, and that isn't the case. So government did listen and did, which is why there's a different set of negotiations after the Australia deal, precisely to take those agriculture concerns into effect. As to where the point lies, obviously there has to be a point at which it lies, but it's very much limited, linked to the point you put to Phoebe. There are obviously some red lines, but you can't go into any negotiation saying these are my standards and these are my terms and I won't discuss them, because that's not a negotiation. You won't get a deal if you do that. So it very much depends upon what they are, and deals around food safety standards clearly are sacrosanct. In many cases for things like that, much is the same with environmental law and animal welfare law as well, you would have to change domestic law. So you wouldn't be saying, I'll accept products from a lower standard or a lower safety critical angle or whatever it is, because you can't sell them when you get to this country. So you'd have to change domestic law. So you wouldn't be simply, I hope that point is one that everyone appreciates, is that you can't deal with the two in isolation. You can't have one product being sold that came in from abroad under a trade deal at a different standard to one that's produced domestically. If you're going to sell it here, you've got to live up to the same standards. So those standards are high and they will remain so. But we need to make sure that wherever the negotiation takes place, inevitably around the margins, which is what always happens in any negotiation, is one that offers us opportunities and protects our own guys at the same time.
Brilliant, thank you. Ben, I wanted to turn to the question of whether the government should follow what the EU's done in imposing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, so a tariff effectively on high carbon imports like fertiliser, like steel, which I know is obviously a huge part of Teesside's heritage, and the extent to which you think that's a model that we should be following in our trade policy.
Yeah, John, just as I will take the liberty also just to make a couple of other points,
Please do.
just from what's been said. Just to put on record, because I think these three statements are important, because just from some of the language that we all use, it can be quite loose, and language will matter in this. So different doesn't necessarily mean better or lower standards. Yeah. There are different ways of delivering environmental standards that might be the same, but just because it's different doesn't necessarily mean it's worse. Cheaper doesn't always necessarily mean lower standards either. I mean, as Eamonn quite rightly talked about, is free trade can deliver efficiencies which can create lower pricing, doesn't necessarily mean lower standards. And again, particularly the New Zealand and Australia conversation, you've got to be really careful not to confuse trade-offs within trade deals as trade-offs for the environment, and sometimes those can get blurred, particularly around the agriculture conversation in New Zealand compared to the one in Australia. So I think it's always important to say that, because we talk about cheaper, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's any worse. This for me is the crux of what we really need to get to as a nation about the direction of travel we want to go in around carbon border taxes, and how do we recognise within the market the issue of protecting the environment. And it's not an easy answer. Saying, for example, on the one hand, and following the European model, we'll just have a carbon border tax. Well, it's not even just about, for example, protection from the Far East and China, because they may have some dubious practices in the way that they go about producing what are, on the face of it, environmentally friendly products, for example, in things like offshore wind, but not necessarily produced in a very helpful way. Because on the other side, you've also got the Americans who are going into mass subsidy, and that's a different market as well. So you've got this issue that people seem to be going down the road of carbon needs to be priced in some way. And a carbon border tax is often floated as an example of that. The concern that I have with that, and I'm going to talk against myself in a second, the concern I have with that is you are in effect suggesting that we need to make things more expensive within the UK to allow for the import of supply chains that are very well established supply chains and deliver efficiencies, and so you cannot buy the most efficient thing, so we're going to deny free trade, and therefore you have to get it more expensively. I think it's an important point, because if you go down that route, the one thing that I'm acutely aware of compared to everything on net zero is making sure you take the electorate and your community along with you. And as soon as you start driving up energy costs, food costs, cost of cars, whatever it might be, pretty much everything, then people are going to rebel pretty strongly against net zero, even though instinctively everybody is supportive of it. But if they see that everything's becoming more expensive, just look what's happening in the world at the minute, people push back against administrations and policy because they perceive that things are becoming more expensive. And if they start to link that to net zero through trade deals and carbon border taxes, then that is, I think, a very problematic place for the net zero agenda to be in. And I don't think we want to get there. And so for me, it's about how do we as a country help educate other countries, and how do we export our technology to help them make that transition. And we're seeing it a lot with the Chinese at the minute. They're obviously trying to corner the market with producing things extremely cheaply in a way that we wouldn't necessarily agree with in the UK. But what they're now trying to do is get up that curve by taking a lot of our technology, sometimes legitimately and sometimes illegitimately, to be able to help them go through that curve. And I think if we want to assert ourselves on a global stage and actually help with more trade deals, then we need to use that as leverage to do so. I think if we go down the route of a carbon border tax, I think we'll find ourselves in a very sticky situation with the electorate, which will put us not where we want to be, and it won't allow us to be able to progress this agenda, which is good not just for the UK, but obviously the rest of the world.
Thank you, Ben and Eamonn, on that same question, if I may, and then I'll go out to the audience.
I think I agree with basically everything Ben's just said. I've been an enormous proponent of carbon border adjustment mechanisms historically, even publishing a paper with Sen a few years ago on exactly this issue. And I think you can kind of separate the theory and the practice. Maybe I'm slightly more optimistic, but I think Ben basically hits on the crux of the issue, that if you start doing these things, start eroding support for net zero and things like that, then ultimately we're not going to get into a good situation at all. Short tweet.
Just very quickly, the carbon border, just to take a step back strategically, if you look at that as a concept, it only works if pretty much the whole world, but certainly the vast majority of the major developed or developing nations buy into it. Otherwise, you're cutting your nose off to spite your face. The UK can moralistically stand there and say we've got a carbon border tax and nothing made, we're not importing anything that is of bad quality environmentally. But the Chinese aren't going to do that. They're not in that place economically at the minute to be able to do it. The Europeans really aren't necessarily going to enforce it in the way that they suggest they might. The Americans certainly aren't going to do it. So again, it's one of those, as you just said, Eamonn, fantastic in theory, but when the rubber meets the road and politics gets involved on a national level, then it's just ineffective. So if we try to do it and go alone, then it's impossible. If you start imposing one in every nation in the country and they all buy into it, well, that's a different conversation, but it's just not realistic.
Thank you. I hope I've got a caller. Katie's here with a microphone. Do I have any questions from the audience? I'll go to the gentleman just behind. I'm going to take three at a time. The gentleman just behind here.
Run off in a minute as well.
Okay. I think Ben's got a hint of what my question might be about, actually. If I could digress slightly to give the question directly the impetus I think it needs. 20 years ago, I went to China and I started importing from China. At that point in time, Peter Mandelson was there, and his job was to ensure that there wasn't dumping in Europe. He didn't succeed at all. The Chinese were dumping in Europe. They put out a 13% export rebate. Nobody could compete. Companies in Europe were going bust, right, left and centre. A friend of mine worked for a French company making nuts and bolts, went bust. Italian companies went bust. The Rust Belt in the United States is directly as a result of that 13% export rebate. When they captured virtually all the world's business, they then reduced it to 5% because they could. And then they reduced it to 0 because it's the workshop of the world. And Ben, I think, has made some brilliant points, which I hadn't heard before and I hadn't appreciated before. But how do you negotiate with somebody, okay, that's 20 times bigger than you? We may have the technology, we may be leaders in the world in terms of brain power and what we can do, but how do we put that into a trade deal with a country that is so massive?
I'm very keen to bring in other people. So if it's one sentence, if you've got one sentence, and then I'll go
one sentence. Okay. In 2 years' time, the Chinese will do a 25-year trade deal to get to 2050. Okay. It's 5 lots of 5 years. Okay. I'd like to know how we're going to negotiate ourselves into that trade deal. And what's in the mind of Mr. Xi in terms of what it's going to be in 2 years from now?
Thank you. I'm going to go for the lady over here next, please. Okay.
Miranda Barker, I'm the Chief Exec of East Lancs Chamber of Commerce. You've touched on so many points there, but I'm going to end up on CBAM. Firstly, really important that we try and reduce the disadvantage we have in the north in this strongly manufacturing area where our products are too expensive to ship because we don't have good road and rail transport networks. It would also reduce their environmental impact, but I'll leave that there because that's a hot potato you might not want to touch. Secondly, we can't compete with the IRA, but if we can put everything else behind our technologies, everything that isn't the amount of zeros that they've got on those contracts to try and help them get into the market, including trying to support our low carbon technologies, which are really world leading in going into countries as part of COP28 type of improvements. We have the ability to lead there. But thirdly, CBAM, I think it's the other way round. I think it's a potential to drive our technologies, because if you're looking at embedded carbon, if you're importing from overseas, our technologies are going to come out positively compared to those coming from Bahrain or Beijing, etc., when you're actually pricing in the carbon. So it's an opportunity to drive onshoring.
Thank you, and I'll take one more for the time being. The gentleman over there.
Great, I'll also stand up. I'm an international trade lawyer by profession, so I'm instinctively in favour of free trade as a driver of progress for exactly the reasons that Eamonn highlighted. On CBAM, I'm really worried about it being adopted as a dead end, which is effectively what it is. It's clearly a breach of the WTO most favoured nation status, and it would undermine the rules-based international trading system that we are so reliant on for our prosperity and economic progress. But actually, the analogy of it being carbon protectionism is instructive, because instead of us having a carbon protectionist approach, maybe something we should be trading as well as goods and services should be carbon. We have an emissions trading scheme. The EU has an emissions trading scheme. Several US states do. Lots of other countries do. And yet never the twain shall meet. You can't trade between those two systems. And therefore the prices in one system don't reflect the prices in another. And you can't reduce CO2 emissions globally, and it's a global problem, in the efficient way that we could be doing if we interlink those systems more effectively. So perhaps, if we're talking about exporting our standards, what we should be doing through those trade negotiations and the international fora that we sit on is making sure we have interlinked trading systems for emissions trading schemes, and that would allow us to reduce the cost of defraying CO2 emissions.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Robert, I'm going to come to you first on this. I mean, I'll let you respond to anything you wanted to pull out particularly, but I wanted particularly this question of China. Is there a risk that we are overstating the level of influence that the UK can have in conversations like this when you have the IRA in the US being so great, when you have the dominance of Chinese supply chains and, as the gentleman pointed out, just the way their political system operates? Can we realistically expect to compete, or is it a case of just finding our niche and sticking to it?
Yeah, it's a very good point, and clearly the way that we deal with China is going to be a massive issue from a trade as well as a geopolitical perspective. But this is why, in particular, CPTPP is so important. It tends to get put into this context of just being a trade deal, and it is a trade deal. And it is where all of the world growth is going to be happening over the course of the next century. But it's not just that. It's a chance of making sure that we influence what that emerging trading standard is going to be. It's not just an economic trade deal, it's also a power block. And it is in geopolitical terms and it is in trading standard terms. So to answer the question about what do we do, how do we cope when we're on our own, the answer is we're not on our own. We make sure that we are with a group of like-minded countries, and CPTPP is a very good example of that. So this always gets seen. I mean, opposition always say to it, why is it so important? They're all miles away. For a start, of course, that's nonsense, because so much of trade, increasingly distance isn't such a concern. But it's about setting the standards within which international trade will be conducted over the course of the years ahead. And that is, absolutely right. And we just, gentlemen, I didn't catch your name, but thank you for those points, which I thought were excellent. And you're also bringing out the importance of not looking at things we tend to look at these things in terms of tariffs. And tariffs are a very blunt way of looking at international trade. That's really quite a 19th century way of looking at it, when really tariffs were all there were. Now, the barriers to international trade and the way in which you can influence international trade is much more about non-tariff barriers, in other words, standards. And it's seeking to shape those that is so important, which is why the point that gentleman there made is absolutely right. It's by seeking to influence those through like-minded people that we get the growth that we need. So as a general rule, I mean, I think we should all be, particularly as Conservatives, we should be in favour of free trade. It brings prosperity, it brings peace, frankly, apart from anything else. It is one of the greatest drivers to human progress that has ever been seen. We should be in favour of it, in principle. That doesn't mean that you don't have any standards. It doesn't mean you don't seek to change the world and to shape the world as you would do to serve your own country and your own interests. It's critical we do that, but we should be looking to make the system work for us. How we deal with China is, of course, the big issue of the country, and they are antithetical in nature to so many of the things we want to do. But we'll only do that by working with friends and partners, not by seeking to shut ourselves off from it.
Thank you. And Phoebe, I'd like to turn to you on that point, if I may. When Robert says, and I suspect there'll be a lot of agreement in here about needing to work with other countries, you're talking about your work on standards and about trying to make sure we're having a high standard. Is that for you a case of us forming a club effectively with other countries, be it on carbon, be it on food standards, and working on that basis, given the issues we've touched on with China in particular?
Yeah, I think it is about working together with other countries. I think one thing I was going to pick up on, slightly different point, is really the situation domestically, and in terms of, do we actually have the regulatory infrastructure to deliver on these standards? I think it's sort of one of the things that we've forgotten about is that the fact that the European Union used to provide us with all that infrastructure, and we have, in the last sort of 10 or so years, really kind of, disinvested in regulators, enforcement bodies, the key instruments that we have there to ensure that when imports do arrive in the country, they are meeting those required standards. On the deals, I think, yes, I mean, we need to work with others. We need to be very clear that that partnership is conditional on standards being at the heart of it, and not sort of push that conversation to one side. And I'd really love to sort of hear much more of that in the public realm, and I think that's something that we haven't had enough of. It has been a question of these trade deals are super sensitive. We can't actually be very open about it. I think that's very risky in the long term to sort of lock out civil society and to be actually very, very kind of almost covert in the way that we are sort of handling those conversations.
I think while we agree with that, I think the only point I'd just make is that I think we do need to recognise where we are now compared to where we were. I mean, we are now seeing, by dint of the fact we're having this debate, and by dint of the fact you've seen it discussed in the media over the course of the last few years, we now have a level of openness and discussion about trade that we haven't had before. You get that discussion in Parliament, you get that discussion. I don't think there'll be any question of civil society being locked out. But we're having the conversation now. The position that used to exist was the European Union decided its trade deals for us, and we were a part of them, whether we liked it or not. And we are not in that position now. Now we can set our own priorities, and we can set our own. We're absolutely clear on the standards that we wish to have. I agree with you, Phoebe, you do need to invest in the agencies you need. That's part of having an own independent trade policy, and we are doing that. But I do think we should recognise that we are, by nature of our new trading arrangements, in a much better position than we were a few years ago.
Thank you both. Eamonn, I was just going to come to you first, and then I'll come to Ben. I wonder if you could deal with the gentleman's point about emissions trading particularly. It feels to me sometimes like the post-Brexit settlement that we seem to have reached is that we like to go it alone on a lot of things, and I think there's a lot of arguments obviously in favour of that. But are we in danger of thinking we have to carve out our own system when actually there are areas where it would make perfect sense for us to engage a bit more closely with others, not just in the EU but elsewhere?
Yeah, I think absolutely. This sort of sense that we have to have our own bespoke solution to everything. I mean, I don't recall emissions trading scheme coming up as a point of debate in the Brexit debates back in 2016. So I don't know why we kind of think we have to sort of translate that into the modern day. That is a shame, because I think we would have a far better, more kind of liquid system if we did. I also just wanted to sort of pick up on the point about whether a CBAM would be in violation of WTO rules, and I don't want to overstate sort of what I know here, but certainly when I was looking into it, I think we could. I think there are 2 articles that allow sort of exemptions for environmental policies to kind of carve out in WTO rules, as long as they're applied consistently and to all sort of member states, and I think we do stuff like that for certain for certain animal welfare clauses at the moment. So I think, and certainly a lot of people seem to suggest that that would be possible. Perhaps the debate's caught up in the last couple of years that I've turned my attention away from it, but I think maybe we could. So yeah.
Brilliant. We will avoid a detailed argument about the WTO articles, if you'll forgive us for now, but it's certainly one to return to. Well, maybe so. I don't know. I don't want to speak on behalf of the audience on that one, but no, thank you, Eamonn. Ben, on those points, and I wonder particularly if you'd deal with the lady's point, particularly about defending domestic manufacturing and how a CBAM would or wouldn't help that.
One of the things that we've done, and we've lived it right, is that if you look at what, in effect, that would do, you've got some manufacturers, got some incredible manufacturers, but you've got manufacturers who are struggling in the UK at the minute because they're not competitive. If they were competitive, they'd be selling their product and we wouldn't have anything to worry about. It's a simplification, but let's just put the building blocks together. So the reason some of our industries are struggling is they are not efficient, they're not competitive, and they are losing out to others elsewhere in the world that are more efficient. And you can build that into, well, maybe they're more efficient because they have lower worker standards, environmental standards, etc. And so that leads you to, well, hang on, we should lock that out of the market and raise our standards and only deal with those products on our standards. What that ultimately means is the person in the street is paying more for those products. And that makes people poorer. So I just don't think that's, in the very simple terms, by locking people out of the market, you are only able to access what's in the market, and that by definition is always more expensive. What we've done in Teesside, and we've had to go through the pain for it to happen, is we always struggled as a region to look beyond the old manufacturing sectors because they meant so much to us, to communities, jobs, livelihoods. But I think people will look back in 10 years' time on Teesside in particular and see the steelworks closing as a new beginning for our region. Because while it's there, it's difficult to look past, right? 3,000 jobs, 3,000 families, communities reliant on it. But now it's not there, it's allowed the community and people to look beyond that and say, well, actually, what do we want to do in a 21st century world? What do we want to do to look forward? And so I just don't think it works. I do think there's an argument, though, more generally, and I think this is less a carbon border tax argument, is when we talk about free trade. And Robert made a really interesting remark in his opening statement about the UK being out of practice. Because if you think about it, we haven't had our own trade policy since the early 70s. And so if we're all frank, the system is not geared up as efficiently as it could be to negotiate trade deals on the UK's behalf. It's getting there, it's investing in those organisations and those departments, it's putting the right people there. But if you think about it, if you had a business and you hadn't done something for 40, 50 years, if not longer, you're not going to be the best at it. It's going to take time to get up and running. And so I think there's an element that we need to be realistic and honest with ourselves that post-Brexit, we'd outsource that. We didn't have it. We don't have the right intellect, the skill set to be able to do it. And we're having to build that up. And it's getting better, but that's going to take time. And then the second point I would say about free trade is that, and this is a conversation I try and have with ministers whenever they listen to me, if you look at the Treasury in particular, the Treasury has a very purist view about how we should trade. The market decides where things go. And in principle, that academic argument of free trade, the market will dictate and the government can then follow behind, is fine if everybody else is playing by the same rules. And we tend to, as a nation, play by the rules. The Chinese aren't playing by the same rules. And with IRA, the Americans certainly aren't playing by the same rules. So I would implore government to look and say, well, let's have a promotion of free trade wherever we can. The market needs to dictate to be able to allocate capital as efficiently as possible. But until the rest of the world do it, we also need to be a bit more savvy, which leads back to having the right team and infrastructure to be able to manage what free trade actually means. And the specific example I'd give is steel. If you look at steel, the free market says we should just import everything from China. It's the cheapest, it's the most efficient, and therefore, for the cheapest price for everybody in this country, we should be buying all that steel, because why wouldn't we do that? The reality is China is losing billions of pounds in their steel industry because it's subsidised. They're gaming the free trade market, and so the Treasury need to wake up and recognise that we're not playing on an even playing field. So when we also talk about free trade, and we could go on for hours and hours about how we do this, free trade doesn't just mean opening our doors to everyone and everything. It requires a subtlety and a maturity in our trade policy that I think we're still getting to grips with about how we manage certain industries, certain products, and our understanding of how the countries we're negotiating with manage those industries in the first place, which isn't definitely in China's case in the same way that we do it. Because again, you might open up the UK or even Europe. In some instances, we've still got steel tariffs between the UK and Europe to be able to protect British steel and Port Talbot. We're doing that because we recognise that it's not just purely about efficiencies and free markets. It's also about politics, sadly, where different nations are using certain industries to drive votes as well. So it's more kind of restating the problem back to you in a different way, that it's a really complex picture, that kind of carbon border taxes just seems a very kind of old school, rudimentary, blunt force that doesn't solve the nuance in global trade relationships.
It's also likely to be met with retaliatory measures, is the thing.
Exactly, yeah.
I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more rounds of questions, and I plead, therefore, to try and keep your questions as brief and answers, hopefully, as brief, please, as possible. I'll go to the lady on the aisle at the back there, please.
Hi there. Hi, I'm Jeanette Aquilina from the British Poultry Council. We're the trade association of poultry meat producers here in the UK. So I recognise the point that imports don't always mean lesser quality. However, without import controls, we don't actually know what's coming into the UK currently. But I'll put that point to the side and keep my question short. I'd love to hear from the panelists what you think about how do we ensure that imports from free trade are not to the detriment of domestic production here in the UK and the investments that producers are making here domestically in net zero and sustainability efforts.
Thank you. And then the lady on this side over there, I can't quite see.
Hi, I'm Kira Box from Friends of the Earth. We've heard a lot today about ensuring standards at home. We've also heard a lot about the UK being a global leader. And I suppose I'm wondering, bringing those two things together, what can and should UK businesses operating abroad be doing in their supply chains? And in fact, what can and should the UK government be doing to ensure that climate impacts are negated, that environmental impacts are prevented or mitigated, and also that human rights are upheld? And I suppose I'm looking particularly at what that might mean in terms of extending the current very limited due diligence legislation that we're expecting to see coming out of the Environment Act. What might the government do to ensure our global supply chains show some leadership there?
Thank you. Do I have another question? The gentleman in the orange tie here, thank you.
Hi, I'm David Bowles from the RSPCA. So just following up on the standards issue, because the panel's talked a lot about safeguarding our standards. We've done 3 trade deals at the minute, CPTPP, Australia and New Zealand, where we have negotiated away our standards, whether they're eggs and chicken from Canada or beef and lamb from Australia. So every country that we're now negotiating with, and we're negotiating 6 trade deals at the moment, every country will come to us and say, we want whatever Canada and Australia got, but more. So is the cat already out of the bag and we've lost the argument on safeguarding our standards?
Thank you very much. Eamonn, I'm going to come to you first on that. I mean, is there a risk with striking these deals that we have, to take the gentleman's point, effectively sort of decided what our standards are, even if we didn't mean to?
Gosh, what a good question. I'm not really sure how to answer that as well. I think the kind of the tension that the question touched upon, and certainly the first one we heard, I think with all of these things, particularly on sort of the animal welfare thing, I think there is very good justifications to be apprehensive about some of the deals we're striking, and certainly where there are kind of a misalignment in quality and standards. I think it's very much appropriate to sort of have those questions about whether it's right to kind of let lesser quality products come into the UK. As for how to enforce that, I mean, I'm really not sure. I think that's kind of come back to the sort of the capacity point among sort of UK agencies, and investing in them, I think, is something that which probably has been sorely neglected, and we see that in certainly other parts of the economy and other regulators as well. I'm not normally the first to kind of champion diverting extra resources to regulators, but I think in certain circumstances that's certainly relevant. So yeah, maybe I'll sort of pause there.
Thank you. Phoebe, I'm going to turn to you. I mean, I think, please pick up on what you'd like to from those questions, but I think one of the things that seems to come through all of them is, where are we assigning responsibility here? Is this a case of the government? Is it about businesses interrogating their own supply chains? Or is there, as I think a lot of very sort of absolutist free traders would argue, let the consumer decide? I mean, where should we strike the balance between those interests?
I mean, I think, first of all our research with business suggests that, you know, there is a strong private sector desire for clear rules, for high standards, and for, you know, a level playing field. So I don't think there's a sort of a sense that you know, businesses out there to kind of strip away at standards and really kind of undermine those standards. So in terms of the question is, how are politicians reading the consumer mood? And I think it would be wrong to say that consumers are, you know, crudely informed by a sort of desire for lower prices. I think there is a sort of sense that, you know, we want to be protected. You know, we don't expect to be, you know, be offered products that are not safe and that don't comply with a certain level of standards. So, in a sense, that is quite a kind of crude sort of distinction between government versus consumers. I think that there is a sort of strong sense that there needs to be intervention. I think there's certainly a strong sense when it comes to things like what we eat, but I think also in terms of what we're buying from abroad needs to be sort of, you know, compliant with certain with those legislations. So yes, I'd say that kind of very stark juxtaposition between consumers versus intervention is actually perhaps too crude.
Thank you. Ben, I'm going to come back on that point.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really interesting part of the conversation, because I think not just in specific terms and the question that was over here, but in broad terms around the environmental agenda. I now see we're in a place where the consumer and business is actually moving faster than government. And that has been part of the agenda of, you know, Friends of the Earth, RSPCA, lots of very valid and important environmental groups that have helped educate the consumer to be able to move beyond that. And that's actually not just the consumer, it's also impacting on businesses. I mean, we were just talking very briefly beforehand to some of the Environment Network colleagues, where, you know, it's slightly going off piece, but the principle stands, where, you know, lots of businesses are waiting for clarity around CFDs for sustainable aviation fuel. And I'm just giving a specific example because it's one that we're working on. We're working with an American business that are not waiting for the CFD for sustainable aviation fuel, because they can see the market demand is already there, and they can build a 200 million litre plant, put 300 million quid in, and they can sell it today for current pricing because the market will take it. And so I think there's a really interesting balance to strike, and this is, you know, much bigger political question, right, about what drives behavioural change. And, you know, it seems to be in the environmental debate, I think certainly over the last 3 or 4 years, if not longer now, it's about how much can government regulate and ban things. And I think what the environmental kind of groups have done more nuancedly, actually, is educate people where it's not necessarily about that, it's about informing decisions. I'm not saying that regulation doesn't play a role, right, because this is a very black and white situation or conversation, when actually reality is that there's a grey, and it's a balance between regulation as little as you need to affect the outcome that you want. Interesting point from the gentleman at the RSPCA, though, moving forward, you know, have we set our standards, you know, because we're now doing these trade deals around the world, and therefore we've kind of set our standard and we can't go above, and that might actually drive standards lower because people might chip away and want a little bit more. I'm not suggesting this is you, so I just think it's a wider debate. I remember the Brexit debate, and a huge part of that Brexit debate was you've got to be inside the tent to affect change. Well, I would argue if we're in, you know, some of these incredible trade partnerships that we've already signed, never mind, for example, ones with India in the future, people might say, oh, that's a degradation of standards. I would say that is Britain working more closely with other nations, and over years, we will be able to, you know, affect our soft power, which the UK historically has been very good at, to change those deals over time, to raise the standards in certain terms. And the very final thing I would say on this point, overall, irrespective of whether it's regulation, a drive to the bottom, etc., a trade deal is just that, it's a deal. And a deal requires two parties to consent. So if it's not good enough for us, then we'll never sign up to it, right? And so if it's not good enough for the other party, it's not going to be signed off either. Now, it's a simple, basic point of doing business and negotiating trade deals, But that then comes back to democracy. And so rather than regulation, I would say, let's push forward with more trade deals. The government have to strike the right balance. There's going to be trade-offs and negotiations on both sides. And ultimately, it's a democracy point that at the next election, if you're not comfortable with the standard that the government is setting, then, you know, like every other policy decision, it's going to be a decision for the public to decide whether they're supportive of it or not.
And then final word on that, Robert, and then I'll try and squeeze in one more question.
Thanks. I'd just like to underline Ben's point about sustainable aviation fuels. It's something I've been working on from our side of things as well. It's a very, very good example of how technology will bring the answers to many of the questions that we are looking to solve, and how there is an economic opportunity to all this. And it's very much a way, if you look at this as whether it's a glass half full or glass half empty point of view, the government can make good things happen in partnership with industry, not just look at stopping bad things from happening. And that's an extremely important way in which we can approach both trade and the environment. On the point about having sold the pass already on trade deals, I don't think so, partly for the reason that Ben gives, that if it's not good enough for us, then we won't sign it, nor would the other side. But simply because every party wants something different in every agreement. No two agreements are ever the same. That's not just true of trade deals, it's true of any contract. And I think it would be looking at things the wrong way to think you ever get carbon copies of one passing to another. They're all different. Everybody wants something slightly different out of each of them. And thirdly, it's belied by the approach that we've taken recently, where we have changed the negotiating approach on some things, like agriculture. Jeanette's point on from the BPC, and I mean, I'm very, very aware of how massive important this is for everyone else. I've got an awful lot of very important poultry in my constituency, so it's an issue that I care very much about. But I was thinking of that issue in my opening remarks when I talked about keeping an eye on the EU trade deal, because what Jeanette's talking about is the import controls that exist under the existing EU deal, rather than what might happen under any new trade deal. So clearly there has to be fairness. Those we're going to have to introduce those import controls to make sure that people producing here are at the same standard of those who are importing from elsewhere. But overall, you know, this is also an area where through those high standards, through the quality mark we undoubtedly have, there are opportunities as well, but clearly fairness has to be absolutely the heart of it, of existing deals and new deals for the future. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try now, and my colleagues will kill me if I don't finish on time, so I'm going to try and just give you all one final 30-second answer, if I may, starting with Phoebe and going down the table. I'd like to try and end on a sort of positive note, if we can, and ask you each just briefly to reflect on what we can do in our trade policy to touch on the issues I think you've all covered about trying to drive up standards here and overseas. What do we need to be able to do that? What's the one takeaway you'd like the audience, myself, everyone else to have on that issue? Phoebe?
Yeah, I think I'll just end with a sort of word of caution around the big political risk around not actually pursuing these deals with a sense of raising standards and actually being open about that being a sort of key part of our goal. I think the sort of short-term risk is that people start sort of feeling a bit like what is going on, but I think there's a sort of more medium-term risk is that when products do start arriving into the supermarket shelves, and when, let's hope not, harm starts to happen, you know, people are going to be held to account, and these trade deals are going to be sort of, you know, held up as one of the causes, you know, whether that is as a consequence of lowering food standards, or whether it's as a consequence of people actually, you know, understanding that, you know, the stuff that is coming is not being produced to the level that they would anticipate domestically, or because they, you know, it's causing a you know, huge environmental harm. So I think there is a sort of real political reason for why the pursuit of higher standards when we are pursuing new trade deals need to be sort of locked in together.
Brilliant. Robert?
Thanks. So I'm hugely optimistic actually about the scenario that we're in, for the reason I've mentioned a number of times. We have control of our own independent trade policy for the first time in 40 years. This is a massive opportunity for us, but it means we can set our own standards. Yes, there are things we have to do. We have to make sure we get our priorities right. We have to make sure that we have the negotiating expertise. We need to have the regulatory bodies. But it's the same in anything in life, that when there's there's an opportunity, you also have to make sure you guard against the risks. But you don't guard against the risks by failing to engage. And I do think there are opportunities here for every sector of the economy, including agriculture, through trading more widely. But at the end of the day, as I said at the beginning, the world trade's a thing. It's not going away. And the way we have the better standards around the world we want to have are by engaging. That's how you export what you want to see. You won't get it by hiding away.
Thank you. Ben, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think you can export those standards, one, by having the infrastructure that we've all talked about, making sure that the right teams are there to be able to manage that and hopefully identify with a third party the benefits of those high standards. But I think the other thing that underpins everything is making sure that as an economy and as a nation we are continuing in research and development and the development of these incredible technologies across industry that can contribute to higher standards, while helping the free market with a more efficient allocation, while tackling those things that we need, and actually then using that as part of our free trade negotiation to export these fantastic technologies to raise those standards. And that's better for everyone, right? It's good for jobs, it's good for wages, it's good for the UK, and it's good for our soft power around the world.
Thank you. And final word, Eamonn.
Thanks, John. 2 years ago, there was a report released by the Board of Trade, had a great foreword in it, written by a woman called Liz Truss. Unfortunately, it seemed to have withered on the vine slightly, but it does contain a lot of, to my mind, extremely interesting ideas, where things like slashing tariffs on green products that still do exist, even though they're less of an issue than they once were. Maybe I'd encourage everybody in this room to go and find that report and have a look through it, and if there's ideas in there that you like, maybe you should champion them yourselves and write to your MPs and other legislators. So yeah, how about that for a recommendation?
Brilliant, thank you. Who knew? Take it away. Go and listen to Liz Truss. Thank you all very much for those remarks, and thank you once again to Unchecked UK for sponsoring this panel. It's much appreciated. The next event in this room is in 30 minutes' time. It's How Can We Restore Nature to These Once Wild Isles, featuring the Environment Secretary, Therese Coffey. While you wait for that, why not visit the Send stand, pick up some freebies, sign up for our network and hear more about today's campaign, which is on wildflowers. My thanks very much to Phoebe, to Robert, to Ben and to Eamonn. Please give them a hand. Thank you very much.